When Rebecca Lawson and her childhood friend Daniela Pierce set off into the granite wilderness of Yosemite National Park in June 2014, they promised Rebecca's husband they would be back before his birthday celebration on Saturday. But Saturday came and went with nothing but silence. For 3 years, search teams combed the towering cliffs and dense forests, finding absolutely nothing. Then in 2017, a team of wilderness researchers detected a faint electronic signal pulsing from deep within an unexplored section of the park. What they discovered would transform a tragic missing persons case into something far more mysterious and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Yosemite National Park is a cathedral of stone and water, a place where granite monoliths rise thousands of feet into the California sky and waterfalls thunder down sheer cliff faces with a force that shakes the ground. It is also a place of profound danger, where the line between breathtaking beauty and sudden death can be measured in a single misplaced step. By Monday, June 16, 2014, that danger had consumed 2 women, and the people who loved them were only beginning to realize it. Rebecca's husband, James Lawson, had spent Sunday evening telling himself stories. Good stories. Reasonable stories. The kind of narratives that keep panic at bay. Rebecca and Daniela had decided to extend their trip by a day. They'd met other hikers and were having too much fun to leave. Cell service in the backcountry was notoriously unreliable, so of course they couldn't call. These were the lies he whispered to himself as he stared at his phone, willing it to light up with a message that never came. Rebecca was 28, a physical therapist with a quiet confidence born from years of rock climbing and trail running. Daniela, 29, worked as a graphic designer and had been Rebecca's best friend since they were 14 years old. They had grown up together in Sacramento, learning to hike in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and Yosemite had become their sacred place, a yearly pilgrimage they never missed. This trip was supposed to be a quick getaway, a 4-day trek through some of the park's less traveled areas. They had permits, detailed maps, and years of experience between them. James had watched them load their packs into Rebecca's SUV on Wednesday morning, their excitement infectious as they reviewed their route one last time. They planned to hike a loop trail that would take them along the rim of a lesser-known valley, through alpine meadows and past a series of remote lakes. It was ambitious but well within their capabilities. They were supposed to be back by Friday evening, Saturday morning at the absolute latest. By Monday morning, James could no longer sustain the comforting fictions. He called the Yosemite Park Rangers, his voice steady despite the cold terror spreading through his chest. He gave them all the details, the trailhead where Rebecca had planned to park, the route they intended to follow, descriptions of both women. The ranger he spoke with was professional and calm, assuring him that they would send a team to check the trailhead immediately. 2 hours later the call came. A ranger had driven to the remote parking area at the base of the trail. There, sitting alone in the gravel lot surrounded by towering pines, was Rebecca's dark green SUV. The doors were locked and a light coating of pollen covered the windshield. Inside, visible through the windows, were the things they had chosen not to carry: a cooler with food for after the hike, a change of clothes, Daniela's laptop bag. The vehicle had been there for at least 5 days, untouched and waiting. The discovery confirmed the worst and started the clock on a massive search operation. Within hours, Yosemite's search and rescue team mobilized. The park sees millions of visitors each year, and lost hikers are not uncommon, but 2 experienced women with a clear itinerary vanishing without a trace was unusual and deeply concerning. The command post was established quickly, a cluster of official vehicles and portable equipment set up near the trailhead. Maps of the region were spread across folding tables, the planned route marked in red. The area they intended to cover was roughly 30 square miles of wilderness, a mix of rocky terrain, thick forest, and steep elevation changes. It was challenging ground, but it was also well mapped and regularly patrolled. They should not have simply disappeared. The first search teams headed out at dawn on Tuesday, moving in coordinated groups along the planned route. They were a mix of professional park rangers and highly trained volunteer SAR personnel, people who knew Yosemite's backcountry as well as anyone could. They carried radios, GPS units, first aid equipment, and a grim determination. They walked the trails, calling out the women's names, their voices echoing off the granite walls. Rebecca. Daniela. The mountains swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. Helicopters joined the effort by midday, their rotors beating the air as they flew low over the forests and high meadows. Crews scanned the ground below with binoculars and thermal imaging cameras, searching for any sign of a campsite, a brightly colored tent, or the heat signature of a human being. But the dense canopy of the lower forests obscured much of the ground, and the rocky expanses of the higher elevations offered 1,000 places where someone could be hidden from view. Family members arrived. James made the drive from their home in Fresno, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Daniela's parents drove up from Sacramento, their faces pale and drawn. They gathered at the command post, feeling helpless and desperate, searching the faces of the rangers for any flicker of hope. They were given updates every few hours, professional and thorough, but the message was always the same. No sign yet. We're still looking. For 6 days, the search continued with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Over 100 people combed the wilderness. They checked every campsite along the route, every overlook, every stream crossing. K-9 units were brought in, the dogs given items of clothing from both women to establish a scent. The dogs followed the trail for a few miles from the parking area, their noses working the ground, but then the scent simply vanished as if the women had been lifted into the air. On the 7th day, the search teams made their first and only discovery. It was found by a ranger named Patrick Donnelly, a 15-year veteran of the park. He was searching a steep, brushy slope about 4 miles from the trailhead when a flash of color caught his eye. Partially hidden beneath a manzanita bush was a water bottle. It was a standard aluminum hiking bottle, bright pink, with a carabiner clip attached to the cap. Patrick carefully bagged it and radioed it in. Back at the command post, James and Daniela's mother, Catherine Pierce, were asked if they recognized it. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. It was Daniela's. She had bought it specifically for this trip, excited about the color because she said it would be easy to spot if she dropped it. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a source of anguish. It confirmed that the women had been in that area, but the location was troubling. It was off the main trail, down a steep embankment thick with brush. Why had the bottle been there? Had Daniela dropped it accidentally, or had something happened that forced them off course? Search efforts intensified around the new location. Teams formed a grid pattern, moving slowly through the difficult terrain, checking every crevice and ravine. But they found nothing else. No other gear, no footprints, no sign of a struggle or an accident. The pink water bottle sat in an evidence bag, a single fragile clue in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. The Park Service had thrown every available resource at the effort, but they could not sustain that level of operation indefinitely. The case was far from closed, and rangers would remain alert, but the massive coordinated search was suspended. James refused to leave. For another week, he hiked the trails himself, often alone, calling out Rebecca's name until his voice was hoarse. Catherine and her husband joined him on some days, the three of them moving through the forest like ghosts, haunted by the absence of the women they loved. Eventually, even they had to return to their lives, to jobs and responsibilities that could not be ignored forever. But the question remained, consuming and relentless. Where were Rebecca Lawson and Daniela Pierce? The official investigation remained open, but as summer turned to fall and then to the harsh winter of 2014, hope began to erode like granite under centuries of wind and rain. James returned to Fresno and tried to continue working, but his life felt like a performance, every smile forced, every conversation hollow. He kept Rebecca's side of the closet exactly as she had left it, her hiking boots still sitting by the door. Catherine Pierce turned Daniela's childhood bedroom into a shrine, covering the walls with photos from their years of friendship, images of 2 girls who had grown into women together, their bond unbreakable. The media coverage, which had been intense during the initial search, faded as new tragedies demanded attention. By the end of 2014, Rebecca and Daniela were just another statistic, 2 more names added to the long list of people who had walked into wild places and never walked out. But in the small community of people who loved them, the search never truly stopped. James organized private search parties every few months, posting notices online and recruiting volunteers. Small groups would spend weekends combing areas that had already been searched a dozen times, driven by the irrational but powerful belief that maybe this time, they would find something. The official investigation, meanwhile, followed its own quiet path. Park rangers continued to file reports. Every piece of found equipment, every unidentified campsite, every anonymous tip was logged and investigated. A database was maintained, cross-referencing the case against others in the park's history. Detectives from the county sheriff's office reviewed the case file periodically, looking for angles that might have been missed. One theory that gained traction early on was that the women had suffered some kind of accident in a remote area, perhaps a fall from one of the many cliffs that lined the higher trails. The pink water bottle suggested they had gone off trail, possibly in distress. Search teams had focused heavily on the steep terrain surrounding that discovery, rappelling down cliff faces and searching the bases of waterfalls, but the vastness of the landscape meant that 100 searchers could walk within 50 feet of something and never see it. Another theory, darker and less spoken about in front of the families, was foul play. Yosemite, for all its natural beauty, was not immune to human evil. There had been cases in the past, rare but real, of violence in the wilderness. But this theory had significant problems. There was no evidence of a struggle. No witnesses had reported seeing the women with anyone else. Their route had been remote, miles from the popular tourist areas where a predator might hunt. It seemed unlikely, but it could not be completely ruled out. As 2015 arrived and then passed into 2016, the case grew colder. James found himself unable to move on in any meaningful way. He attended grief counseling, where a kind therapist tried to help him process the ambiguous loss, the torment of not knowing. But how do you grieve someone who might still be alive? How do you accept death when there is no body, no closure, no final goodbye? He started a blog, posting updates about the search and sharing memories of Rebecca. It became a small community. Other families who had lost loved ones in the wilderness would comment, sharing their own stories of hope and heartbreak. The blog kept Rebecca's case alive in the digital world, a flickering candle in the vast darkness of the internet. Catherine Pierce threw herself into advocacy work, connecting with organizations that focused on wilderness safety and missing persons. She gave interviews to local news stations on the anniversaries of the disappearance, her face drawn but determined, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She raised money to fund additional private searches and to support other families in similar situations. The pain had transformed her, hollowing her out but also making her fierce. Daniela's father, Robert, took a different path. He stopped talking about it entirely. The weight of not knowing had broken something inside him, and he retreated into silence. His grief turned inward where it burned like a slow, suffocating fire. The family fractured under the pressure, each member coping in their own isolated way. By the spring of 2017, nearly 3 years after the women vanished, the case had settled into a kind of stasis. The official file was thick with reports and maps and witness statements that led nowhere. The private searches had become less frequent, the volunteers harder to recruit. The trail, if there had ever truly been one, had gone completely cold. James had finally, reluctantly, begun the process of having Rebecca declared legally dead, a necessary step for insurance and financial reasons that felt like a betrayal of everything he still wanted to believe. And then, on a clear morning in May 2017, everything changed. A team of 4 researchers from the California Geological Survey were conducting a study in a remote section of Yosemite, several miles from any established trail. Their work involved mapping underground water sources using ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic field detection equipment. The team was led by a geologist named Dr. Raymond Colt, a man in his 50s with a methodical mind and a passion for understanding the hidden structures beneath the Earth's surface. They had been working in the area for 2 days, taking measurements and recording data, when one of the team members, a young technician named Aisha Brennan, noticed something unusual on her equipment. She was operating an ELF detector, a device designed to pick up extremely low-frequency electromagnetic signals, the kind usually associated with geological formations or underground water movement. But as she swept the area near a rocky outcropping, the device registered a signal that did not fit the expected pattern. It was faint but rhythmic, pulsing at regular intervals. She called Dr. Colt over, and he examined the readings with a frown. The signal was definitely artificial. Natural geological processes do not create perfectly regular pulses. This was something electronic, something man-made, and it was coming from somewhere beneath the ground. The team spent the next hour triangulating the source of the signal, moving their equipment in a careful grid pattern across the rocky terrain. The signal grew stronger as they approached a section of the hillside that appeared, at first glance, to be nothing but a jumble of boulders and scrub brush. But as they cleared away some of the vegetation, they found it. Hidden behind a massive fallen slab of granite was a narrow opening, a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air flowed from the gap, carrying with it the damp, mineral smell of a cave. Dr. Colt shone a powerful flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed a passage that dropped steeply downward, disappearing into darkness. He held the ELF detector near the entrance. The signal spiked dramatically. Whatever was creating the electromagnetic pulse was inside that cave. The team stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling over them like the shadows cast by the towering pines. An artificial signal emanating from an unexplored cave in the backcountry of Yosemite was not something that could be ignored. Dr. Colt made the decision quickly. This was beyond the scope of their geological survey. Whatever was down there, it needed to be investigated by people with the proper training and authority. He used his satellite phone to contact park headquarters, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Within an hour, the call had been escalated, and a park ranger was en route to their location. By early afternoon, Ranger Thomas Whitfield arrived, accompanied by a second ranger and a member of the park's technical rescue team. They listened to Dr. Colt's explanation, examined the equipment readings, and peered into the dark mouth of the cave. The decision was made to conduct an initial exploratory entry. Ranger Whitfield, who had advanced cave rescue training, volunteered to make the first descent. He geared up with a climbing harness, rope, helmet, and headlamp, and carried a two-way radio. The opening was tight, forcing him to turn sideways and shimmy through the gap. Once inside, the passage opened slightly, angling downward at a steep grade. The walls were smooth granite, polished by ancient water flow. He descended carefully, his boots finding purchase on the slick rock. After about 30 feet, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber. He swept his headlamp across the space, revealing a cavern roughly the size of a small bedroom. The floor was uneven, scattered with rocks and debris. And there, in the center of the cavern, his light caught something that made his breath stop. It was a backpack. A large, weathered hiking backpack lying on its side. Next to it was a sleeping bag partially unrolled and a small camp stove. The gear was covered in a fine layer of dust and cave sediment, but the colors were still visible. The backpack was teal blue with gray accents. Whitfield's mind raced. He knew the park's missing persons cases by heart. Every ranger did. He keyed his radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. I have found camping equipment down here. It looks like it has been here for a long time. I need to investigate further before I can confirm anything, but you need to get more people out here now. He moved closer to the backpack, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. Clipped to one of the straps was a small laminated tag, the kind hikers used to label their gear. He leaned in, angling his headlamp to read the faded handwriting. The name on the tag was Rebecca Lawson. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Park Service and within hours, through the families who had been waiting 3 years for any news. James received the call from a park investigator while he was at work. The words seemed impossible to process. They had found Rebecca's gear. She had been in a cave. He left immediately, driving to Yosemite in a blur of speed and desperate hope, his mind spinning with questions. Was she alive? Had she been trapped? Why had no one found this cave before? By the time he arrived at the command post that had been hastily re-established near the cave entrance, the site had been transformed into a full-scale operation. The narrow opening had been widened slightly to allow easier access, and a sophisticated rope system had been installed. Portable lights powered by generators illuminated the area, and a forensic team from the county sheriff's office was preparing to enter. James was not allowed near the cave itself. He stood with Catherine and Robert Pierce at a perimeter marked by yellow caution tape, watching the organized chaos unfold. A detective named Linda Marsh came to speak with them, her face a mixture of professional composure and genuine sympathy. She explained that they had recovered both Rebecca's and Daniela's backpacks, along with other camping equipment. She confirmed that the gear matched the inventory that had been provided 3 years earlier. But she also delivered the news they were dreading. There were no signs of the women themselves. No bodies, no remains, nothing to indicate what had happened to them after they entered that cave. The question that consumed everyone now was simple but agonizing. How had they ended up in an unexplored cave miles from their planned route? And where had they gone after leaving their gear behind? The forensic team worked through the night, documenting every item in the cave with painstaking care. Photographers captured the scene from every angle. Each piece of equipment was cataloged, measured, and eventually carefully removed for further analysis. The backpacks were opened, their contents laid out on sterile tarps. Inside Rebecca's pack, they found clothes, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, and a journal. The journal was a revelation, a window into the days before the women vanished. Rebecca had been documenting their trip in neat, precise handwriting. The entries from the first 2 days were cheerful, describing the stunning views, the physical challenge of the terrain, and the joy of spending time in the wilderness with her best friend. But the entry from the 3rd day, dated Saturday, June 14th, took a darker tone. Rebecca wrote about how they had decided to take a detour to explore a side canyon that was not on their original route. Daniela had spotted what looked like a waterfall in the distance and wanted to get a closer look. They had left the main trail, intending to be gone for just an hour or two. But the terrain had been more difficult than it appeared. The canyon walls were steep and the ground was loose and treacherous. As they worked their way deeper into the canyon, Rebecca wrote that they had heard a strange sound, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. And then, without warning, the ground beneath Daniela's feet had given way. Rebecca described it in frantic, disjointed sentences. Daniela had fallen, dropping suddenly through a hidden opening in the canyon floor, a sinkhole concealed by a thin layer of soil and rock. Rebecca had screamed her name and crawled to the edge of the hole, shining her flashlight down. She could see Daniela below, maybe 20 feet down, lying on the floor of what appeared to be a cave. Daniela was alive but hurt, calling up that she thought her ankle was broken. The journal entry ended there, the final words trailing off mid-sentence. The rest of the pages were blank. What happened next had to be pieced together from the evidence found in the cave and the strange electronic signal that had led the researchers to the site in the first place. Inside Daniela's backpack, the forensic team found the source of the signal. It was a small personal locator beacon, a PLB, a device designed for exactly this kind of emergency. When activated, a PLB sends out a distress signal on international emergency frequencies, broadcasting GPS coordinates to search and rescue satellites. But this particular device had a critical flaw. It was an older model, and at some point the GPS antenna had been damaged, likely during Daniela's fall. The beacon was transmitting, but it was sending out only a weak, fragmented signal on a frequency that was not being monitored by the standard emergency response systems. Instead of a clear distress call with precise coordinates, it had been broadcasting a faint, irregular electromagnetic pulse, the same pulse that Dr. Colt's equipment had finally detected 3 years later. The realization was devastating. Daniela had activated the beacon, doing exactly what she was supposed to do in an emergency. But due to a combination of equipment failure and bad luck, her call for help had gone unanswered. If you are captivated by stories of mystery and survival, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Hit that like button if this story has left you on the edge of your seat, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on what might have happened to Rebecca and Daniela. Your engagement helps bring these incredible stories to light. The investigation now focused on reconstructing the timeline. Rebecca, according to her journal, had descended into the cave to help Daniela. The camping gear suggested they had set up a temporary shelter in the cavern, probably while Rebecca tried to figure out how to get Daniela, with a broken ankle, back out through the sinkhole opening above. But the opening was unstable, and the journal suggested Rebecca feared it might collapse further if she tried to climb back up with Daniela. The forensic team explored the cave system more thoroughly over the following days. Using advanced mapping equipment, they discovered that the cavern where the gear was found was not isolated. It connected to a series of tunnels that extended horizontally into the mountain. Some of the tunnels were tight squeezes, barely passable, while others opened into larger chambers. The system was complex and disorienting, a maze of stone that could easily trap someone unfamiliar with cave navigation. 300 feet into the tunnel system, the exploration team found another critical piece of evidence. In a narrow passage, they discovered a makeshift marker, a torn piece of fabric tied to a small rock outcropping. The fabric was bright yellow, and the forensic team quickly matched it to a rain jacket that had been listed in Daniela's gear inventory. It was a trail marker, a sign that the women had ventured deeper into the cave system, leaving behind clues to help them navigate back. The discovery painted a picture of desperation and determination. Unable to climb back out through the unstable sinkhole, Rebecca and Daniela had made the decision to search for another exit. They had entered the tunnel system, marking their path as they went, hoping to find a way out through the mountain. But caves are deceptive places, especially to those without proper training. Passages that seem to lead upward often dead end. Tight squeezes can open into vast chambers that offer no exit. The darkness is absolute, broken only by whatever light source you carry, and when those batteries die, you are left in a blackness so complete it feels like a physical presence. Detective Marsh assembled a team of expert cavers, professionals who spent their lives exploring underground systems. They entered the cave network with sophisticated equipment, mapping software, and powerful lighting arrays. Their mission was to follow the trail that Rebecca and Daniela had left behind and determine if there was, in fact, another way out. For 4 days, the caving team worked in shifts, pushing deeper into the mountain. They found more markers, pieces of torn fabric, and small cairns of stacked rocks, signs that the women had been methodical and resourceful. But they also found evidence of struggle. In one section, the tunnel narrowed to a passage barely 18 inches wide, a claustrophobic squeeze that required the cavers to remove their packs and pull themselves through using only their arms. On the rough stone walls of this passage, they found scrape marks and a small smear of what appeared to be dried blood. The women had forced themselves through this hellish constriction, driven by the hope of finding an exit on the other side. The tunnel system extended much farther than anyone had anticipated. The mapping team tracked over half a mile of interconnected passages, some angling downward, others climbing steeply upward through the granite. The environment was harsh and alien, with sections where water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating slick, treacherous surfaces. In other areas, the air was stale and thin, making breathing difficult. On the 5th day, the caving team made a discovery that fundamentally changed the investigation. Deep within the mountain, in a section of the cave that required advanced technical climbing to access, they found an exit. It was not the same sinkhole opening through which the women had fallen. This was a different entrance entirely, a horizontal opening in a cliff face that emerged on the far side of a steep ridge, more than 2 miles from where the women's camping gear had been found. The exit was partially concealed by vegetation and would have been nearly impossible to spot unless you were standing directly in front of it. But it was real and it was passable. Standing at this opening, looking out at the dense forest beyond, the lead caver radioed back to the surface team with the news. They had a route. Rebecca and Daniela could have made it through. They could have exited the cave alive. The implication sent a shudder through everyone involved in the investigation. If the women had successfully navigated the cave system and emerged on the far side of the ridge, then the question was no longer whether they had survived the initial accident. The question was what had happened to them after they escaped the darkness. A new search operation was launched, this time focused on the area surrounding the cave's exit point. The terrain was brutal, a nearly vertical slope covered in thick brush and loose rock. It was miles from any established trail, in a section of the park that saw almost no human traffic. Search teams fanned out from the cave exit, moving in expanding circles, looking for any sign that the women had passed through. On the second day of this new search, a volunteer searcher named Gordon Felix found something. He was working his way through a dense thicket of manzanita when he spotted a flash of color that did not belong to the natural landscape. Pushing through the branches, he found a torn piece of nylon fabric snagged on a branch. It was the same shade of yellow as the rain jacket fabric found inside the cave. The discovery confirmed that at least one of the women had made it this far. The search intensified around the new find. Teams moved slowly and carefully, examining every inch of ground. 20 yards from where the fabric was found, they discovered a small clearing where the ground showed signs of disturbance. The dirt had been scraped and piled, and there were several large rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern. It looked like someone had tried to create a signal, a marker that could be seen from the air. The realization was heartbreaking. Rebecca and Daniela had made it out of the cave. They had survived the fall, the injury, and the terrifying journey through the mountain. They had emerged into daylight, and they had tried to signal for help. But they were in one of the most remote sections of the park, miles from any trail, in terrain so difficult that even the search helicopters 3 years earlier would have had trouble spotting anything through the dense canopy. The ground search continued, but the trail grew cold again. There were no more fabric markers, no footprints in the hard, rocky soil, no other signs of passage. It was as if the women had simply vanished for a second time, swallowed not by the earth but by the endless forest. Detective Marsh authorized a broader air search, using the new location as a starting point. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the area, but 3 years of weather and decay meant that any heat signatures or obvious signs were long gone. The forest had reclaimed whatever secrets it held. As weeks passed, the active search was once again scaled back. The case file was updated with the new evidence, the cave system, the exit point, the signal clearing, but there were still no answers about the ultimate fate of Rebecca Lawson and Daniela Pierce. James stood at the cave exit one afternoon, his hand resting on the rough granite. He tried to imagine Rebecca emerging from the darkness, exhausted and injured but alive, filled with hope that she would see him again. The thought was almost too painful to bear. Catherine Pierce visited the signal clearing, kneeling in the dirt where her daughter had arranged rocks in a desperate plea for rescue. She wept for the first time since the initial disappearance, her grief finally finding a tangible focus. Her daughter had been here. She had been alive. She had fought so hard. The forensic analysis of the items recovered from the cave provided additional insights. The journal, the backpacks, and even the damaged locator beacon were sent to specialized labs. Analysts were able to extract more information from the journal using advanced imaging techniques that revealed faint impressions on pages where Rebecca had pressed down while writing on previous pages. These ghost writings filled in some gaps, describing how they had rationed their food and water, how Rebecca had splinted Daniela's ankle using tent poles and duct tape, and how they had made the decision to venture deeper into the cave after spending 2 days hoping for rescue that never came. The emotional tone of the later impressions was darker. Rebecca wrote about fear, about the oppressive weight of the darkness, and about her determination to get Daniela home no matter what. The final legible fragment was a message to James, telling him that she loved him and that she was fighting to get back to him. Investigators also examined the area around the signal clearing more closely. They found evidence that someone had spent at least one night there. There were the remnants of a small fire, just a few pieces of charred wood and ash, carefully arranged in a shallow pit. Testing of the ash confirmed it was approximately 3 years old, consistent with the timeline. This meant that after escaping the cave, the women had stopped here, built a fire for warmth, and attempted to signal for rescue before moving on. But moving on to where? The forest in that area was a maze of steep ridges and deep valleys. Without a trail to follow and with at least one person injured, their options would have been limited. The most logical direction would have been downhill, following the natural drainage of the land toward lower elevations where they might find water and, eventually, trails or roads. Search teams focused their efforts on the drainages and creek beds below the signal clearing. It was exhausting work, scrambling down slopes so steep that ropes were often necessary, pushing through tangles of vegetation that clawed at clothing and skin. But they found nothing. No more fabric markers, no abandoned gear, no sign that anyone had passed that way. The investigation brought in a survival expert, a man named Dr. Neil Bannister, who had spent decades studying wilderness survival and the psychology of people lost in extreme environments. He reviewed all the evidence, the timeline, the condition of the recovered gear, and the geographical challenges the women would have faced. His assessment was both hopeful and grim. Given that Daniela had a broken ankle and that both women would have been exhausted, dehydrated, and possibly suffering from hypothermia after their time in the cave, their physical condition would have been severely compromised. However, the fact that they had made it through the cave system demonstrated remarkable resilience and problem-solving ability. Dr. Bannister theorized that they would have prioritized finding water, which meant following drainages downhill. But in their weakened state, even a minor additional injury, a twisted knee, a fall, a worsening of Daniela's condition, could have been catastrophic. He also noted that the Yosemite wilderness, while beautiful, is home to wildlife that can pose serious threats to injured and vulnerable people. Black bears, though rarely aggressive, are drawn to food and the scent of human activity. Mountain lions, solitary and stealthy, occasionally prey on animals and in rare cases have attacked humans. The women, moving slowly and potentially unable to defend themselves effectively, could have encountered dangers beyond the purely environmental. The investigation took another turn when Detective Marsh began cross-referencing the new evidence with other incidents in the park around the same time period. She was looking for anything unusual, any reports that might provide a clue about what happened after the women left the signal clearing. What she found was a single incident report filed in late June 2014, about 2 weeks after Rebecca and Daniela were first reported missing. A group of backpackers had been camping near a remote lake approximately 6 miles from the cave exit point. They reported hearing strange sounds during the night, what they described as someone calling out or crying for help in the distance. The sounds had been faint and intermittent, carried on the wind. The backpackers had been unsettled enough to report it to a ranger when they returned from their trip, but at the time, rangers had investigated and found nothing. The location had not been connected to the missing women because it was far outside their planned route. But now, with the knowledge of the cave system and the exit point, the location made terrible sense. It was downhill from the signal clearing, following the natural drainage just as Dr. Bannister had predicted. Detective Marsh organized an intensive search of the area around the lake. It was early autumn by this time and the weather was beginning to turn. The search teams worked against the clock, knowing that winter snows would soon make the area inaccessible. 4 days they combed the forest around the lake, checking every hollow, every crevice, every place where someone in distress might have sought shelter. On the 4th day, a search dog team made a discovery. The dog, a German shepherd named Copper trained in cadaver detection, alerted his handler to a spot beneath a dense overhang of rock, a shallow depression that formed a natural shelter. The handler approached carefully, his heart heavy with dread. Inside the shelter, partially covered by years of fallen leaves and forest debris, he found human remains. The discovery was handled with reverence and care. The medical examiner was brought to the site, and the remains were carefully excavated and documented. The process took hours, and the D-post fell into a somber silence as word spread. Based on the clothing fragments and the skeletal structure, the medical examiner determined that the remains were those of a female, approximately late 20s in age. The bones showed evidence of an old fracture to the lower left leg, consistent with the injury Daniela had sustained in the fall. The dental records, compared against Daniela Pierce's dental history, provided a definitive match. They had found Daniela. The shelter where she was found also contained other items. There was a small pile of pine boughs, arranged as a crude mattress. A few feet away were the scattered remains of what appeared to be a makeshift crutch, a long branch that had been stripped and shaped. There were also remnants of a fire pit, long cold, and the rusted remains of a small pocket knife. The evidence told a story of survival and struggle. Daniela had made it to this shelter, probably with Rebecca's help. They had created a refuge here, a place to rest while Daniela's injury prevented further travel. The medical examiner's analysis indicated that Daniela had survived for some time after reaching the shelter. The cause of death could not be determined with absolute certainty due to the decomposition and the passage of time, but the examiner noted that exposure, dehydration, and complications from the untreated fracture were all likely contributing factors. There was no evidence of trauma beyond the broken ankle, no signs of an attack by an animal or another person. Daniela Pierce had fought to survive for as long as her body could endure, and then the wilderness had claimed her. But the discovery raised an agonizing new question. Where was Rebecca? If Daniela had been in the shelter and if Rebecca had helped her get there, then what had happened to the other woman? The search around the lake intensified, with teams expanding their radius. The dog teams worked tirelessly, but no other remains were found in the immediate area. Detective Marsh formulated a theory based on the evidence and the psychological profiles of both women. Rebecca, knowing that Daniela was too injured to continue, had likely stayed with her friend for as long as she could. But eventually, faced with the reality that Daniela was dying and that they desperately needed help, Rebecca had made the decision to go for rescue. She would have left Daniela in the shelter with whatever supplies they had left and set out alone, intending to find a trail or a ranger station and bring back help. It was a decision born of love and desperation, and it meant that Rebecca could be anywhere. Investigators mapped out the most likely routes Rebecca would have taken from the lake. The nearest established trail was about 8 miles away, a grueling journey through difficult terrain. Search teams walked those routes, calling her name, looking for any sign. They found nothing. The case went public again with renewed media attention. The discovery of Daniela's remains and the theory that Rebecca had set out alone brought the story back into the national consciousness. News outlets ran updates and social media buzzed with speculation and theories. If you have been moved by this heartbreaking story of survival and loss, please take a moment to share this video with others. Stories like these remind us of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. Subscribe to stay informed, and let us know in the comments what you think happened to Rebecca Lawson. Tips and information hotlines were established, and the Park Service received dozens of calls. Most were well-intentioned but unhelpful, people reporting sightings from years earlier that could not be verified or offering theories that did not align with the evidence. But one call, received 3 weeks after Daniela's remains were identified, stood out. A woman named Judith Ramos contacted the tip line. She explained that she lived in a small town about 40 miles from Yosemite, on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. In late June or early July of 2014, she could not remember the exact date. She had been driving home from work on a rural highway that skirted the edge of the national forest. It had been early evening and the light was fading. As she drove, she had seen a woman walking along the shoulder of the road. Judith remembered the encounter vividly because the woman had looked completely out of place. She was dirty, her clothes torn, and she walked with a pronounced limp. Judith had slowed down, intending to offer help, but as she pulled alongside, the woman had waved her off, shaking her head emphatically and continuing to walk. Judith had assumed the woman was a troubled drifter or someone who did not want assistance, and she had driven on. She had thought about the encounter occasionally over the years, but it was not until she saw the news coverage about Rebecca Lawson that she made a possible connection. Detective Marsh traveled to meet Judith in person. She brought several photographs, including pictures of Rebecca from before the hike and age-progressed images showing what she might look like after weeks in the wilderness. Judith studied the photos carefully. She could not be certain, she admitted. The woman she had seen had been gaunt and weathered, barely recognizable as the vibrant person in the original photos. But the build was right, the height seemed correct, and there was something about the eyes in the age-progressed image that felt familiar. It was possible. It was even likely. But it was not definitive. The highway where Judith had seen the woman was mapped and analyzed. If Rebecca had somehow made it out of the wilderness and reached that road, she would have been about 15 miles from the lake where Daniela's remains were found. It would have been an almost superhuman feat of endurance, especially in her condition, but it was not impossible. The investigation shifted focus again. If Rebecca had made it to a road, where would she have gone? The nearest town was small, barely a few hundred residents. Investigators canvassed the area, showing Rebecca's photo at gas stations, diners, and motels. No one remembered seeing her. Bank records and credit card activity showed no transactions after June 2014. Her phone, which had been turned off or out of service since she entered the park, never reconnected to any network. It was as if she had reached the edge of civilization and then vanished for a third time. One theory that gained traction among investigators was that Rebecca, traumatized by the loss of her best friend and the ordeal she had endured, had chosen to disappear. Perhaps the psychological weight of what she had been through was too much to bear. Perhaps she felt guilt over Daniela's death, believing irrationally that she should have done more or done things differently. In such a state, disoriented and damaged, she might have walked away from her old life, seeking anonymity and isolation. This theory was supported by consultations with psychologists who specialized in trauma. They explained that severe trauma can fundamentally alter a person's sense of identity and rationality. Survivors of extreme ordeals sometimes experience a disconnection from their previous lives, a feeling that they can never return to who they were before. But James refused to believe it. He could not accept that Rebecca, who had fought so hard to survive, would choose to abandon him and everyone who loved her. He continued his own search, traveling to the town near the highway, posting flyers and speaking to anyone who would listen. Catherine Pierce, devastated by the confirmed loss of her daughter but finding some measure of closure in the recovery of Daniela's remains, joined James in his efforts. Together, they became advocates for missing persons cases, working to improve search protocols and support other families trapped in the same nightmare of not knowing. To this day, Rebecca Lawson has never been found. Her case remains open, classified as a missing person with suspected survival beyond the initial incident. The cave that swallowed her and Daniela still sits in the remote wilderness of Yosemite, its entrance now marked and documented. The shelter where Daniela spent her final days has become an unofficial memorial, occasionally visited by hikers who leave small tokens of respect. The final resting place for Daniela Pierce was chosen by her family. Her remains were cremated, and her ashes were scattered in the Sierra Nevada, in a place she had loved. James holds out hope, irrational perhaps but unshakable, that Rebecca is alive somewhere, that one day his phone will ring and her voice will be on the other end. But as the years pass, hope becomes harder to sustain. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are too painful to ever fully uncover. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and prayers for the families still searching for answers. Like this video to help spread awareness about the importance of wilderness safety and the enduring mysteries that remind us how vast and unforgiving nature can be. Subscribe for more stories that explore the thin line between survival and tragedy. The case of Rebecca Lawson and Daniela Pierce stands as a haunting reminder that even in our modern world, with all our technology and resources, there are still places where people can be lost and questions that may never be answered.